Yemen's unity appears to be in real jeopardy as southerners take to the streets to protest what they consider long-time marginalization. Just what went wrong? Has the Yemeni government failed the south? And what are the implications of a divided Yemen? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. Piracy, drugs and poverty. On top of these existing problems, less than 3 weeks away from the anniversary of unification on May 22nd, a fresh outbreak of fighting looks like it could threaten Yemen's fragile unity. This weekend, several people were killed in clashes between security forces and anti-government protesters. Yemen has only been united since 1990. Before that, it was split between the north and south. The most recent violence was sparked a week ago after protests by southern separatists. They want to return to the separate states of North and South Yemen. They claim the unity government has marginalized the south. They said it redistributes wealth from the south unevenly and favors the north of the country. Last week's rally was intended to mark the anniversary of the civil war in 1994. So how did the 1994 civil war start and end? Well, the union reached in 1990 between the Marxist-led South and the tribal-dominated North was tentative. It fell apart in January 1994 and a political crisis developed, leading to civil war in the same year. The socialists were crushed by President Ali Abdullah Saleh's army, and thousands of southern political and military leaders went into exile. Since then, there have been ongoing tensions with southerners who claim the union is more like an occupation than a unity. Well, joining us today are our guests in Sana'a, Mohammed Al-Qadi, correspondent for the national newspaper and political columnist for the Yemen Times. In New York, Fawaz Gerges, professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at the Sarah Lawrence College. And in London, Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi, senior research fellow at the Centre for the Study of Democracy at Westminster University. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Gerges, if I can begin with you, do these latest clashes in the south pose a real threat to the unity of the country?
Absolutely. I think there are multiple fault lines in Yemen, tribal, regional and ideological. I think the most dangerous is the north-south divide. And I think in the last year or so, I think a movement for separation and autonomy has gained momentum. I think there's a widespread feeling in the north, in the south, that basically the south has been marginalized, that there is no equal development, that is the north basically controls and runs affairs in the south without taking into account the aspirations and the hopes and the concerns of the south. So it's very serious. And in fact, American officials here are terribly concerned about the potential for the breakup of Yemen and the potential that could have devastating consequences for the country and its neighbors as well.
Mr. Qadi, do you agree with that point, that the tensions have persisted between the north and the south for a long time now? And the perception in the south seems to be that the northern part of the country is economically privileged. Is that in fact the case?
Yeah, I guess, I believe I agree with Mr. Gerges that it's a very serious problem that has been going on, since the civil war in 1994. And it is one of the consequences of this civil war. You know, for 3 years, these people have been protesting, they have been demanding their rights. Actually, it started with the military and civil servants, asking for because they have been forcibly retired after the civil war. They have been asking for their rights to go back to the army, for pensions. And, you know, the government has not tackled this issue seriously at the beginning. They did not pay much attention to it until it has accelerated and it has reached this point in which these people who have been who have come to unity, peacefully in 1990, and who have been taking the initiative, to take this step of unifying Yemen, the south and north. Now they are suffering a lot of problems, and the result is the political violence.
Well, let me put some of what you say then to Mr. Afendi. The tensions between the north and the south have been long-running. The people of the south have been complaining for a long time now. As Mr. Qadi says, there have been protests. They've been demonstrating against their marginalization, discrimination, the lack of benefits. Why has the government failed to address their grievances?
I beg to differ slightly. I don't think this is an issue, a South-North issue. I think it's an issue to do with the government and the central government and the way it was running things. There is intense centralization. There is one-man rule, and there have been protests in the north. In the case of the Houthi, for example, insurrections. There have been the opposition has been trying to unify against the ruling party. So there are generalized protests, but they take a specific form in each situation. And there are some political entrepreneurs from the south who have tried to exploit these anger in the south. There is anger in the south, there is disaffection, but dictatorial regimes like the one we have in Yemen or semi-authoritarian regimes tend towards centralization, alienating all the population. And this
Mr. Georges, do you agree with that? Do you agree with that point that you have marginalization and discrimination in the north as well, and what you in fact have is this central government, this elite, which is failing to address or to address the needs of the population as a whole in both the north and the south?
Well, I think Dr. Effendi is correct, and I'll tell you why he is correct. I think in order to understand what's happening now in Yemen, we need to understand to unlock the Yemeni puzzle, and there are three keys to unlock this particular puzzle. What I call chronic poverty, endemic corruption, and chronic factionalism and tribalism in Yemen. And I think those three keys basically relate not only to the north-south divide, but for the entire country as a whole. You're talking about 22 million people in Yemen. Between 40 and 45% of the Yemenis live either in poverty or below the poverty line. More than 60% of the population are almost illiterate. You have a heavily centralized government. But the question in the south has taken a decisively, basically, a nationalist tone, in the sense that people in the south, leaders in the south, feel they have been ghettoized and marginalized, that the north basically controls the affairs of the south, and the protests have been going for a long time. And that's why it seems to me what's happening now is that the movement for separation has gained momentum. More and more, even some of those leaders who are basically on the side of the unity now have joined the camp of the separatists.
Mr. Qadi, do you agree with what Mr. Georges says, that Yemen is one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in the Middle East? Poverty and unemployment affects the entire country. You have the same problems in the north as you do in the south, but the difference is that the opposition in the south has taken a different form, a different tone.
Yes, I mean, yes, Yemen is one of the poorest countries, and I agree with Mr. Al-Afandi that it's not a question of south and north. I mean, it's not very clear absolutely here, because we have so many problems across the countries. We have problems in the north, in Saada. It is still, I mean, there is a potential that it might break out again. I mean, the fighting between the rebels and Houthis and the government. And we have also grievances, I mean, here, economic problems. It's not only in the south, but, you know, because in the south it was clear, it was very visible, because the people were ruled by a socialist regime in which they were used to depend basically on the support of this of the regime or the socialist.
Mr. Qadi, Abdurabu Mansour Hadi, the Yemeni vice president, he has himself admitted, hasn't he, that there has been wrongdoing and corruption on the part of the government when it comes to dealing with the south particularly?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of wrongdoings, there are a lot of corruption here in Yemen, and I think, and I can say, I mean, very clearly that corruption is the main headache of the country. I think if the government has, I mean, tackled the issues and the problems that appear here and there, basically in the south, because, you know, big chunks of lands, I mean, have been looted after the civil war by influential tribal and military leaders. And, you know, the government set up a committee in 2007, and the recommendations that the committee came out with is that you know, the president has to choose whether to sacrifice the state or the country, or to sacrifice 15 corrupt officials. And after that, we haven't heard any action from the government. And I think, I mean, to solve such kind of problems, Yemen is likely to face a lot of problems. You know, today there is some kind of, the situation is calm in Radfan and in Lash today, because the government has sent a committee again there. But I think these painkillers, they are not useful, they are not sustainable. The government has to have
Well,
a
Mr.
sustainable,
Effendi, let me ask you, the US
to
government in Sana'a issued a statement saying it was concerned about incidences of political violence, calling upon the government and political parties to engage in dialogue and address legitimate grievances. Is the government taking any steps in this direction?
I think that the stage has passed for measures taken by the government, because I think, as Fawaz Gigis has said, and as Mr. Qadi has said as well, this thing has been going for many years. 2 years ago, we hosted a seminar at our center here where these grievances were voiced, and we raised the alarm. The government and the government supporters' response was to ridicule these claims that there's serious threat to unity, threat to stability, and saying that these people are isolated. The Yemeni media, official media, is saying the same now, that these things are isolated, that these are outside instigators, so and so and so. I think we have to see something like changing government, like resignation of Mr. Ali Abdullah Saleh, like changing the constitution. In order to save the Yemeni unity, you have to have a radical change at the center.
Mr. Judges, southern protesters don't just want the government to address their wrongdoings anymore. They now want independence. Is it too late to correct the mistakes of the past?
No, I don't believe it's too late. I think it would be a tragedy. I think it would be a tragedy for Yemen and a tragedy of the Arab world. As a student of Arab politics, and we teach, by the way, the failed unity experiments in Egypt and Syria in the late 1950s, and Egypt and Libya and other Arab states, and we think and we hope that the unity experience in Yemen is here to stay. It's durable. But I think what I would like to argue, there are some major substantive initiatives need to be taken immediately, not just by the government, by the Yemeni government, but also by civil society. I'm hoping a coalition, a progressive coalition of the opposition, along with civil society and leaders in the south, and also some of the progressive leaders within the government, would basically address the issues by giving the south a critical say in running their own affairs.
So there needs to be a national dialogue amongst all the political forces on the ground.
What I'm saying is that you're really talking about initiatives that have to do with equal development policies, developmental policies throughout Yemen. You're talking about fighting endemic and pervasive corruption. I mean, corruption is bleeding Yemen dry. Corruption is the vehicle that basically killing Yemen, and also giving the South a critical and pivotal say in running its own affairs. Decentralization basically would serve not only the hopes and the aspirations of the South, but also Yemen as a whole, I believe.
Okay, well, let's take a look now at the implications if the protesters were to, in fact, get a separate state. Well, Yemen will have failed in its unity experiment. The government could collapse and the country could fall into the hands of armed tribal groups. It could become a safe haven for terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, especially considering they've already established sanctuaries in the country. The US has expressed its concern, as well as neighboring Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, which shares a border with Yemen. In addition, curtailing the piracy problem in the Gulf of Aden could become an even bigger challenge. The West wants to send its forces to the region, but it needs to have Yemen as an ally to coordinate with. Okay, so Mr. Effendi, what would an autonomous southern state mean for Yemen as a whole?
If autonomous within Yemen, that I think will benefit Yemen as a whole. If there was a kind of federal system or a decentralization, it will benefit Yemen as a whole. And I think you are right in the sense that Yemen is under serious threat of becoming a failed state. We have seen these processes before. In hindsight, it has happened in Yugoslavia, it happened in Darfur, it happened in other countries around the world, Somalia before. The warning signs are there. From also the experience we had in the past, drastic action has to be taken early.
Mr. Kadi, do you agree that the solution to the recent violence, the ongoing clashes, the protests we've seen in the south, are for the southerners to have an autonomous state, that we could, in that situation, see the violence come to an end or at least die down?
As Mr. Georges and my colleagues said, I mean, it's very important. It's a very critical moment in the history of Yemen, and it needs, I mean, a very critical and very drastic action by the people in charge. I mean, it cannot continue like this. I mean, because this situation will lead to a mess. If we continue, I mean, if Yemen sees now peace for some time, it will break down again and will erupt. I mean,
but
violence
is autonomy
here and
the
there.
solution?
We need a very. I think it's, I mean, local governance with measure power, with, I mean, power to the people to run their own affairs. I think it is the best solution for Yemen, to keep Yemen united. Because Yemen, it cannot break down again into south and north, but it will break out into different, I mean, states, in the small states, and it will mean that.
So you're talking about autonomy, but not independence.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. This is the only solution. I mean, it's I mean, giving powers to the people in the south, to different parts of the country to run their own affairs. I mean, this is the only solution.
Mr. Georges, President Ali Abdullah Saleh recently said that if the country were to split, things would break down, there would be chaos, people will fight from house to house. Does he paint an accurate picture, a prediction of a scenario of what would happen?
I think so. I think the consequences, the repercussions of the breakup of Yemen would be catastrophic for Yemen and its neighbors and the region. I think there's a real danger that Yemen could become the Afghanistan of the 1980s and 1990s. There's a real danger that Yemen could become a state like Somalia, but with a more pronounced and more potent threat. Remember here, you have a nexus between poverty, between factionalism, and between separation. You have multiple fault lines, not just between the south and the north. You have the Houthi in the north, and you have factionalism in many countries in Yemen. You have tremendous arsenal of weapons, unlike Somalia and even Afghanistan. Yemen basically is a military, one of the most militarized societies in the world. So, and in fact, not only Yemenis, but even Yemen's neighbors, and I could tell you here, the debate in Washington, they're terrified, they're terrorized. That Yemen basically, if Yemen, the weakening of the Yemeni central government authority, the breakup of Yemen could basically threaten not only Yemen as a state and society, but also its neighbors,
let me put some of what you say
to
Mr. Effendi. Over the past year, Al-Qaeda has been blamed for a string of attacks, including an armed assault in September on the U.S. Embassy in Sana'a. Can we expect more such attacks over the coming months? Is the situation in Yemen only going to get worse if we see continuing instability in the south?
Yes, I think the existence of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in Yemen is a function of the weakness of the Yemen state. The Yemen state, because of the tribal structure of the country, its reach doesn't reach all over the country. So there are pockets where insurgents can find room in. Now, with the rise of insurgents like Al-Houthi insurgency, and if insurgency also starts in South Yemen, this means that the state will have still many areas, more areas which cannot reach. And this will be open to any other group to exploit it. And I think of course, already Yemeni public opinion and the pro-government are accusing neighboring states of being involved in what's happening in Yemen. We remember that in the 1994
Well, Mr. Kadi,
war,
let me put some of that to you. What, if anything, can the central government do about this, given that, as Mr. Effendi points out, large parts of Yemen are not directly under central government control, and that's what allows groups like Al-Qaeda to function, to have a safe haven, to have a presence in the country?
This is true. I mean, because, you know, now some parts of the country, they are I mean, there are parts of the countries like Marib, Al-Jawf, and Shabwa, in which Al-Qaeda is operating freely. I mean, it's existing now, and they have strongholds there. But if the situation, I mean, escalates, I mean, if the insurgencies, I mean, accelerate here and there, it means Yemen will be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. It will expand its terrorist attacks, and it will take Yemen as a stronghold to launch attacks to not only inside Yemen but out. I mean, against neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia.
Mr. Georges, what is the way forward? Do Western governments need to work towards an effective regional approach with Gulf states, with particularly Saudi Arabia?
I mean, I think if you read carefully the American statement, I mean, this is the first time that the American State Department says basically that the Yemeni government is called upon to have a real and genuine dialogue with the opposition. It talks about addressing the legitimate grievances of the opposition.
But the Yemeni government has consistently failed to do this.
Absolutely, and that's why what I'm trying to say here is that the American government is sending a very powerful message to the central government in Yemen that basically this is a very precarious situation, that it needs to be addressed in the sense of giving the South a critical local say in running its own affairs, in fighting the endemic and chronic corruption, and also in creating what I call an institutional approach. Rather than really basically based on nepotism and based on, a tribal spreading the pie around. But I also would suggest that, I think the Yemenis have a real concern that Yemen's neighbors are pouring fuel on a raging fire. As you know, yesterday or the day before, the Yemeni foreign minister met with the foreign ministers of the Gulf, and he was extremely, extremely blunt. He said any kind of support, any kind of voicing support for what's happening in the south would be a red line. I think the Yemenis are extremely anxious about what's happening, not just in the south here, by the way. There are serious reports saying that the dissidents in the south are linking with the Houthi, basically dissidency in the north. And also there are some reports, some of the former jihadis, some of the former fighters in Yemen who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, basically have joined the insurgency in the south against the governments. The same jihadis who fought with the governments in 1994 against the socialist government in the south.
Mr. Effendi, one quick final word from you in response to what Mr. Georges has said. Is Yemen on the way to becoming a failed state?
It is, unless radical change happens at the center. I don't think autonomy for the South now is enough. We have to have radical change, and probably the resignation of Mr. Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. In Sana'a, Mohammed Al-Qadi, in New York, Fawaz Georges, and in London, Abdul Wahab El Effendi. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.